Killers leave all kinds of evidence behind. Hair, clothing fibers, sometimes even weapons. But there are other kinds of evidence, signs of a criminal mind at work.
And what I've always said was, it was to understand the artist, you must look at the artwork.
It's called profiling, using research from convicted murderers and crime scene evidence to create a portrait of a killer.
Anyone can make the arrest, but I'm wanting to know really what makes them tick.
A common-sense approach to detective work whose results can seem magical.
But it was just an uncanny prediction. It turned out to be exactly correct.
It's like the FBI people were on the other side watching this crime as it was occurring.
Atlanta, Georgia. Between January 1979 and May 1981, more than 200 murders occurred in and around the city. But the most troubling of these crimes were the mysterious deaths of 28 children and teenagers. It would be the nation's first major test of criminal profiling. July 28, 1979, police responded to a foul odor in a wooded area off Niskey Lake Road in Atlanta's predominantly black East Point section. Upon arrival, they found the body of 13-year-old Alfred Evans, who had been missing for 3 days. 150 feet away, police also discovered the partially decomposed body of 14-year-old Edward Smith, who had been reported missing for a week. Coroner's reports indicated that Evans had been strangled and that Smith had been shot with a .22 caliber weapon. Searching for suspects and information, police combed the housing projects where both Smith and Evans lived. They came up empty. 2 months later, 9-year-old Yusuf Bell, also from Atlanta's southwest side, was sent to the corner store near his home. He never arrived. On November 8th, police found Bell's body inside a classroom at an abandoned school. The boy had been strangled. Police still had no suspects and not enough evidence to link the crimes to one another. 5 months later, 9-year-old Jeffrey Mathis was sent with $1 to a nearby gas station where he was to buy cigarettes for his mother and return immediately home. An hour passed. 2 hours passed. Jeffrey's mother began to worry. Late that evening, she called the police and reported her youngest son missing. Just a few days earlier, she had warned him against speaking to strangers.
And he said, Mama said, I don't talk to strangers. I don't go to cars.
On April 15th, Mathis and Camille Bell announced they were banding together to publicize the murders of black children in Atlanta.
We are frustrated and we are frightened.
Over the next 2 months, 5 more victims were claimed. All young black children, all from poor neighborhoods. In mid-July, Mayor Maynard Jackson and Public Safety Commissioner Lee Brown announced the formation of a task force to investigate the possibility of a connection among the murders. The task force included the FBI. The murders presented the FBI with a unique opportunity to utilize a new and controversial investigative technique, criminal profiling. Special Agents John Douglas and Roy Hazelwood were dispatched to Atlanta. Their task, create a profile of the killer. Quickly, both agents established one likely fact about the unknown suspect.
I knew at that point in time that we were probably dealing with a black male, someone that could move comfortably through that environment without attracting attention.
For the special agent who had pioneered criminal profiling, this was the first chance to legitimize the technique as a valid investigative tool.
It was tough. It was a lot of pressure because had I screw up that analysis, the whole program could have went down the drain.
Working out of the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, Douglas had made a name for himself by conducting field research on serial killers, research that would one day become the basis for the film Silence of the Lambs.
We go into the penitentiaries at nighttime and interview the subjects, and much to our surprise, that they were very, very anxious to talk to us.
Over a 5-year period, Douglas and a colleague interviewed more than 30 of the country's most notorious serial killers, including Richard Speck, Charles Manson, and David Son of Sam Berkowitz. Much of the questioning focused on each criminal's family life, childhood, and teenage years, looking for patterns of behavior and background. By the time Douglas and his colleague Roy Hazelwood got to Atlanta, the number of victims had risen to 16. From the beginning, Douglas was careful to tell the Atlanta police and task force officials that his profile would not solve the case by itself.
What I say is, I'm only offering you one little piece in the puzzle. I am not going to solve the case. You're going to solve the case. You got to do the hard work.
Both profilers visited the crime scenes of Evans, Smith, Milton Harvey, and victims Christopher Richardson and Earl Terrell.
There wasn't evidence to be gleaned from those scenes. It was more like, what type of area did the offender feel comfortable in abducting the children from? What type of area did the offender feel comfortable in disposing of the children?
By February, 3 more victims had been claimed. 15-year-olds Terry Pugh, Patrick Rogers, and 14-year-old Luby Jeter. The list of missing and murdered children now numbered 19. Then, on February 13th, the news that Jeffrey Mathis's family had been dreading. Task force members found the remains of the boy in a wooded area of nearby Rockdale County. He had been missing for nearly a year.
I was already relieved. I was relieved knowing that he was dead and in good care with Jesus Christ at 10 years old.
After 3 weeks of investigation, the FBI agents issued their profile.
The principal profile was a black male in his early to mid-20s, a police buff who was living in this community.
The findings were met with skepticism. Atlanta police officers, many of them black, became outraged when they found out the criminal profile pointed to a black male as the prime suspect.
The police said, "Hey, John," he says, in fact, "Hey, Douglas, we saw your profile. It's a bunch of BS."
Police soon had another important tool to help focus their investigation. Hair and fiber evidence pulled from the bodies of at least 10 of the victims were similar enough to assure investigators that the murders were connected. To John Douglas, the hair and fiber evidence was a sign of how physically close the killer got to his victims.
The unknown subject had some kind of relationship. He was coming in contact with these kids. At some point, he snaps and he decides to kill them.
Douglas also predicted that the next group of victims would be found near water.
The medical examiner came forward and was basically boasting that we were getting very good evidence. We were getting this hair and fiber evidence off of the bodies, and what we suspected and felt was that a good way to wash away that evidence is to dump the bodies in water.
Over the next 3 months, a total of 9 more victims would be found. 7 of them in the Chattahoochee and South rivers. All of the victims, like many of the previous 19, had been strangled. The task force now set up round-the-clock stakeouts of every bridge along both rivers. After nearly 2 weeks of surveillance, with no suspects and no more bodies found in the rivers, task force officials gave the order to shut down the stakeouts, effective at 6 a.m. on May 22nd. At 2:30 that same morning, a police cadet working an area of northwest Atlanta near the James Jackson Parkway Bridge heard a splash. He raced to the top of the bridge and pulled over a 1970 Chevrolet station wagon. He questioned the driver briefly, then let him go. The driver's name, Wayne Bertram Williams. After police had spotted Wayne Williams on this Atlanta bridge in May 1981, the FBI agents began studying his background to see whether he fit their profile. He did. The profilers had predicted the perpetrator would be a police buff, someone who gained access to his victims by impersonating a police officer. The 23-year-old Williams had been arrested 5 years earlier for impersonating a cop. A neighbor of the Williams family told the FBI that kids still thought Williams was a policeman because he carried a badge. Born and raised on Atlanta's southeast side, Williams was an only child who still lived in the same house where he had grown up with his schoolteacher parents. Locally, he had made a name for himself as a record promoter and talent scout. He placed flyers around his neighborhood, recruiting teenagers to audition for him. 3 days after Williams was pulled over, another strangled body was discovered floating along the banks of the Chattahoochee, about 1 mile from the bridge. It was 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater, a borderline retarded man from Atlanta's east side. Police now made it known that they considered Williams their prime suspect, but did not yet have enough evidence to arrest him. They placed him under tight surveillance. For the next month, his every move was recorded by Atlanta police, the FBI, and the media. The murder spree came to a sudden halt. In early June, police obtained a search warrant for the Williams home. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation was called in to search for matching hair and fiber evidence. 3 weeks later, based on a positive match of hair and clothing fibers from the Williams home to 12 of the victims, police arrested Williams for the murders of Jimmy Ray Payne and Nathaniel Cater. For the FBI profilers, the arrest was a vindication of a new program, which many people within the Bureau regarded as hocus pocus.
I mean, it felt tremendous, and really not so much as an individual, because I wanted the program to succeed. I felt this was a viable investigative tool that could not be a substitute for an investigation, but can enhance an investigation.
And enhance a prosecution. The Fulton County DA's office requested a second profile of Williams to help them plot their courtroom strategy. Douglas portrayed Williams as an angry young man seeking power who wears a mask to cover his personal inadequacies. He challenged authorities, intimidated them, and almost played out his own script. For his part, Williams had hired one of the best defense teams in the South, including former Georgia Solicitor General Mary Welcome.
Now, Richard, my client is innocent. He did not kill anyone.
I think Wayne began to realize, hey, this is kind of serious here. And I could understand, from his perspective, I didn't do it. And I'm just going to sit back and wait for them to find out for themselves that I didn't do it.
When the trial began in late December, prosecutors leaned heavily on the hair and fiber evidence retrieved from Williams' car and home, which matched fibers on the murder victims.
But to me, that's the strength of it. It was as strong as leaving a physical item to me that says this is from the Williams home.
But to FBI profiler John Douglas, who was seated right behind the prosecution table, it looked like the jury was losing interest in the complicated details.
Our experts were, I think, at times way too technical. They said, I think you guys are losing the case.
With the trial still underway, Douglas returned to the FBI Academy in Virginia, but not before making another prediction.
During the trial, he leaned over to me and he said, 1 week from today, Williams is going to fake illness. And I said, John.
Why? And he says, because they're beginning to lose this case, and it's going to be a sympathy ploy on his part.
Exactly 1 week to the day after the prediction, Wayne Williams was rushed to Grady Memorial Hospital, complaining of chest pains. Doctors found no medical problem. Douglas, at home in Virginia when he heard the news, was called back a second time to help prosecutors.
So now it's like E.F. Hutton, that this guy, however he's doing, we don't understand it, but he's predicting things that are taking place before our eyes.
The profiler predicted that Williams would take the stand in his own defense.
John said very early, a team of wild horses couldn't keep him off the stand. He's going to take the stand.
Reluctantly, on February 22nd, Defense attorney Mary Welcome called Wayne Williams to testify.
We said, Wayne, what they're going to try to do is to make you angry. You can't be angry. You've got to be calm, but you cannot be emotionless either.
When it came time for Assistant DA Jack Mallard to begin his cross-examination, he was armed with some valuable advice from John Douglas.
And he suggested that I keep him on the stand as long as possible, that he might break sooner or later. And finally, the last day, the third day on the stand, he came out doing battle.
Up to that point, through 2 days of cross-examination, Williams had remained calm, his demeanor never shaken. On the third day, Douglas suggested that the prosecutor try a new approach.
I said, what you have to do, Jack, is you have to, at some point, violate his body space. I want you to grab his hands and, at some point, whisper in a low voice, what was it like, Wayne, when you wrapped your fingers around one of the victims' throats? Did you panic, Wayne? Mallard got very, very close. He was blocking out the defense attorneys on the side. The judge could hardly hear him. The jurors could hear him. And what he said was, what was it like, Wayne, when you wrapped your fingers around Terry Pugh's throat? Did you panic? And he said in a weak voice, no.
Realizing he had just admitted involvement in a murder, Williams shot back at the prosecutor. You're trying to make me fit that FBI profile, but you're not going to do it.
And then you look at the jurors, and the jurors, their mouths are wide open. And they saw that this person has this propensity for violence for the very first time.
A courtroom sensation based on insight from a criminal profile.
What Wayne gave them was just another cog in this profile wheel that they were constructing. And they needed that rage, because rage is a necessary part of killing.
Williams' defense team never recovered from the 1-2 punch of hair and fiber evidence and the outburst in the courtroom. On February 27, 1982, the jury found Williams guilty of both Payne and Cater's murders and sentenced him to 2 life terms in prison. In 1983, Williams began a lengthy appeal, accusing prosecutors of covering up information that the Ku Klux Klan was involved in at least 2 of the murders. On July 10, 1998, a judge denied his appeal. Anchorage, Alaska, 1983. The disappearance of 14 young women cast a dark shadow over the 49th state. June 12th, with the scenic Chugach Mountains as a backdrop, prostitutes and drug dealers were making their usual rounds in the city's red light district. A 19-year-old prostitute was working her corner of 5th and Denali Streets. A man approached and offered her $300 for oral sex. She agreed. He took her back to his house in the upper-middle-class Muldoon neighborhood and raped her. He then chained her to a basement pillar and went to sleep. The next morning, June 13th, 5 a.m. A clear, quiet morning at Anchorage's Merrill Field. Local pilots were arriving, hoping to take advantage of the nearly 20 hours of daylight. The night before, the kidnapper had told the prostitute they were going to his cabin in the mountains. As they drove to the airport, she planned her escape. She would jump from the car before they boarded the plane. High heels in hand, she jumped and ran barefoot from the car and toward 5th Avenue. He ran after and yelled, "I'll kill you, I'll kill you." An Anchorage police officer tracked the woman down at a local motel and took her statement about the abduction and rape. He brought the prostitute back to the airport. She walked up and down the rows of small planes but was unable to identify the aircraft. As they were walking, a security guard who had been on duty told the officer that he had seen a man running from the nearby woods and getting into a green vehicle. The officer contacted the police dispatch unit, who told him that the car was owned by Robert Hansen of 7224 Old Harbor Road in Anchorage. Hansen was a prominent citizen, married, the father of 2 children, and the owner of a bakery downtown. When questioned about why he was at the airport so early, he told officers that he and 2 friends were working on his airplane late into the night, and that with the plentiful daylight, they had lost track of time. A few days later, Anchorage police dropped the case.
No, he's not arrested. It was possibly a hooker who had been not paid for a trick by a local businessman out on a night with the boys, and that she was getting back at him for not paying her.
For Officer Greg Baker, the case was anything but closed.
Well, we had an ongoing problem before this happened regarding missing dancers.
The dancers, 14 women, all reported missing. The story was almost always the same. One of the girls, like 27-year-old Sue Luna, would tell a friend that she would be meeting someone who had offered her a lot of money for a sexual encounter. She would attend the initial meeting and never be heard from again. Officer Baker took all of the records on the Hansen case and turned them over to the Alaska State Troopers, who were handling the investigation of the missing dancers. Trooper Glenn Flothy had been pursuing the case since the body of 23-year-old dancer Sherry Morrow was found in this wooded area along the Knik River, 50 miles northeast of Anchorage, in 1981. In July 1983, 2 hunters discovered the body of Paula Golding, also an exotic dancer. The remote location of her body was accessible only by airplane. Hansen was the only one of a handful of suspects who had a pilot's license.
And then as we dug a little farther into his criminal background, it became even more apparent that if we did not move quickly to put a stop to him, that he would probably kill again.
Robert Hansen came to Alaska from Minnesota in 1970. Not long after his arrival, he opened a bakery. He was featured in a 1982 local newscast. He had a trademark stutter that most customers and friends recognized as an embarrassment for him. A closer look into Hansen's background revealed personal demons that haunted him from his teenage years. An arrest at 18 for arson, jail time in 1972 for assaulting a woman in downstate Seward, and a 5-year sentence in 1977 for larceny. He was paroled in 1978. With the discovery of the Anchorage police report, Flothy was convinced that the only way to secure evidence was to serve a surprise search warrant on the Hansen home. Little did the trooper know that an FBI profile would hold the key to not only securing the warrant, but to the mystery behind Robert Hansen. After being denied cooperation to file a search warrant from the Anchorage District Attorney's Office, Flothy remembered an article he read in Psychology Today magazine on the FBI's profiling unit. He called the FBI Academy at Quantico and requested the profiling unit. The trooper talked to profiler Roy Hazelwood. After outlining the purpose of his call, he began to tell Hazelwood about his suspect, Robert Hansen.
And he goes, no, stop. He said, I don't want to know anything about the suspect right now. You tell me about the victims, and let me tell you about the suspect.
Because if you give us any information about a suspect, then we're going to be impacted by that. We're human beings.
The trooper told Hazelwood about the body dump sites and the missing dancers, and about the prostitute who escaped. He told the profiler about a pair of .223 caliber shells found at the Goulding and Morrow body sites. After only 10 minutes of discussion over the phone, Hazelwood began outlining a profile.
He was very comfortable with the outdoors. We were convinced of that. He was very comfortable with the environment in which he disposed of the bodies. We were convinced of that. The fact that he was a hunter doesn't take a genius to figure that out.
And a couple of things that he mentioned, quite frankly, startled. He said this individual may stutter. Robert Hansen did, in fact, have a stutter.
The trooper believed the phoned-in profile would be more than enough information to obtain a search warrant. But to bolster his case further, he requested on-site profiling. John Douglas made the trip to Alaska.
This person here was a real asocial type. He had this speech impediment. He had a very poor self-image. He had to pick victims like prostitutes who really had to have the gift to gab, because he doesn't have to have the gift to gab.
On September 16th, 1983, with the FBI profile in hand, Flothi went to the district attorney to request his help in securing a search warrant. He was denied a second time. The trooper took matters into his own hands, preparing the necessary affidavit. For nearly 3 straight days, Flothi wove the FBI profile, the physical evidence, and Hansen's criminal background into a request to search Hansen's home, car, bakery, and aircraft. Based in part on Hazelwood and Douglas's profile, a judge now granted the warrant. The next day, Flothi led the search of Hansen's home and car. Nearly everything that the profilers had said would be in Hansen's house appeared. Profilers were again right on the money. They found hunting paraphernalia, a cache of guns, disguise kits, and jewelry that belonged to several of the missing dancers. Authorities took Hansen in for additional questioning. Once again, he denied any knowledge of the killings, and by day's end was only charged with the kidnapping and rape of the prostitute on June 13th. In February 1984, hoping to spare his family a trial, Hansen offered to give some information about the victims, but stopped short of confessing to the murders. But there was one piece of evidence that Hansen did not know about.
During the search, we also uncovered several flight maps. And when we looked at the map and compared the location of several of the X's to the known locations of bodies already found, they matched perfectly.
Hansen knew his long criminal road was over. He confessed to a total of 17 murders over a 3-year period. Using the map found in his home, Hansen led police to the remote body sites of 14 additional victims. For his crimes, Hansen was sentenced to life plus 461 years in the Alaska State Penitentiary. Lexington, South Carolina. For high school senior Sherry Faye Smith, May 31st, 1985, should have been one of the happiest days of her young life. She was on her way home from a local shopping center to change clothes, then off to a rehearsal for graduation ceremonies. She pulled into her driveway, stopping to get the mail. A few minutes later, her father, who had seen the car pull up, went outside to greet his daughter. He walked to the end of the long driveway. He noticed Sherry's car empty, the engine running, and the driver's door open. Her purse was on the front seat. He called police. Lexington County Sheriff James Metz was one of the first to arrive.
So we immediately went out there, started getting some background information, was able to find some people who had seen Sherry pull into the driveway and a car come by slowly.
Within 24 hours, friends, neighbors, and schoolmates came together to search for Sherry. Because of the Smith family's prominence in the community, Lexington became a city focused on one goal: finding Sherry Faye Smith. The next day, June 1st, after an exhaustive day-long search of an area near the shopping mall, police were left with no leads. The Smith family went to bed early, hoping to resume the search the next morning. At 2 a.m. on June 2nd, the phone rang. Sherry's mother, Hilda, answered the call.
On the other end is an individual who sounds like he's disguised his voice in some way, and he was letting her know that Sherry was with him.
Police began taping the conversations with the kidnapper, hoping to trace the calls. The sheriff made frequent trips to the Smith home, sometimes talking to the abductor himself. During one of the conversations, the sheriff challenged the kidnapper to come up with some proof that he was holding Sherry hostage.
He said, "I will send you something. You will get something in the mail that will confirm that this is no hoax, that I am telling you the truth."
On Sunday, the sheriff contacted the town's postmaster and found a letter awaiting delivery at the local post office. The letter, a chilling goodbye from Sherry Faye Smith to her family. In it, she told each family member she loved them and said, "Please do not become hard or upset. Everything works out for the best for those who love the Lord. Even after receiving the letter, the Smith family still held out hope that she was alive.
We just want to simply say that whoever it is that has our daughter Sherry, we want her back. We miss her. We love her. And please send her back home where she belongs.
But for Sherry's abductor, the game was far from over. The kidnapper knew that Sherry was a water diabetic and kept her family's hopes alive by talking about her medical condition.
Can you answer me one question, please? Can you tell me, is she all right physically without her medicine?
Sherry is drinking a little over 2 gallons of water per hour.
2 days later, Wednesday, June 5th, the kidnapper calls again, this time with directions.
Take Highway 378 west to Traffic Circle. Take Prosperity exit. Go 1.5 miles. Turn right at sign. Moose Lodge number 103. Go 1/4 mile. Turn left at White Frame Building. Go to backyard. 6 feet beyond, we're waiting. God chose us.
Until the phone conversation where he gave directions, the kidnapper had led the family to believe that Sherry was still alive. The body of Sherry Faye Smith was found behind the white building. She had been strangled to death. An autopsy report later showed that she had been left there for at least 4 days. For Sheriff Metz, the answer became clear. This was a different type of criminal that he had experienced in his career. He also knew where to turn for an additional investigative tool.
I understood what profiling was all about, and I knew that it could be helpful to us. I knew it may not be the cure-all, but it could give us information based on evidence and the way people acted.
The sheriff contacted the local FBI office and requested the assistance of the profilers. The help came in the form of John Douglas and Special Agent Jim Wright. The agents listened to the tapes that had been made of the kidnapper's phone calls. By this point, the kidnapper had called the Smith home 3 more times, each time talking to Sherry's sister, Dawn Smith.
And it was very, very, very difficult to want to just scream and yell and cry, and knowing I could not do that because now I had to no longer worry about finding Sherry, but worry about keeping this man on the phone long enough for him to be caught.
From the phone conversations, as well as crime scene photos and a review of Sherry Smith's background, Douglas and Wright created a profile of a white male, shy and polite to strangers. He would be overweight and considered unattractive to women. Drawing on his experience interviewing serial killers, Douglas figured he would be a meticulous person, since many of his phone calls to the Smith home recounted very specific times and dates. Douglas believed he would be following news reports of the murders. He also told Sherry's father not to fear an additional kidnapping of his other daughter, Dawn.
This was not the type of serial killer that would be pulling into your driveway and killing your second daughter. This guy's a real coward.
Then the phone calls stopped. For over a week, as the Smith family grieved over the loss of Sherry, their only source of communication with their daughter's murderer seemed to be cut off. June 14th, 1985, 9 days after Sherry Smith's body was found, 9-year-old Deborah Helmick was abducted from her front yard in the trailer park where she lived in neighboring Richland County. With a murder and now an abduction on his hands, the South Carolina sheriff requested the FBI's on-scene help in the investigation. John Douglas made the trip to South Carolina. 1 week later, the killer called again. Dawn Smith took the call.
Have you heard about Deborah May Hamrick, the 10-year-old? Helmick?
Richland County?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Okay, listen carefully. Go 1 west, turn left at Peach Festival Road, go 50 yards, and to the left, Deborah May is waiting. God forgive us all.
The directions were to the body of little Deborah May Helmick. What began as the case of a single abduction had now turned into an investigation of a double murder. As Lexington residents reacted to the killings, it would be Sherry's own last will and testament and the criminal profile that would help solve both cases. Police had been working with a South Carolina crime laboratory and doing tests on the paper on which Sherry Smith had written her last letter. Technicians used a machine designed to pick up impressions left by pens and pencils from sheets that had been in a notepad. They detected a grocery list and what seemed to be a phone number.
And so when he made her sign the last will and testament, he ripped off that page or two, so to the naked eye it looked like a clean sheet of paper. But when it was processed, they came up with this indented writing, all but one digit.
Using the phone number as their guide, police followed a trail of evidence, ultimately leading to the home of Ellis and Sharon Shepard, who lived in nearby Saluda County. Sheriff's deputies raced to the Shepard home to find that not only did the couple not fit the profile, but had been out of state on vacation when the two murders occurred. So police read the profile to the Shepards. They told the couple about the unknown subject's weight, his likely problems with women, and about the subject's meticulous nature. Ellis and Sharon Shepard looked at each other and uttered the same name, Larry Jean Bell. The criminal profile created to help solve the murders of two South Carolina girls had led police to a man who had been house-sitting for a local couple, Ellis and Sharon Shepard, when the crimes occurred. His name, Larry Jean Bell. FBI profilers John Douglas and Jim Wright predicted to Lexington County, South Carolina Sheriff James Metz that the murderer would be in his 30s, would have failed, possibly violent relationships in his past, and would likely have a lot of flexibility in his job. They said he would probably have an arrest record. Bell was in his 30s and occasionally worked as an electrician. He had been arrested for making harassing phone calls in 1979.
So everything about the criminal profile fit only one person, Larry Jean Bell. The age matched, the fact that he would be extremely neat matched in his room. Everything was just precisely in place in his vehicle. Everything was as neat as a pin.
The day after Bell's name surfaced, deputies searched the Shepard home. After finding hair samples that matched victim Sherry Smith, Sheriff Metz issued a warrant for Bell's arrest. Sheriff's deputies arrested him on June 27th.
I am innocent. I've been justly...
From jail, Bell requested a meeting with Sherry Smith's sister, Dawn. She went to the police station and sat down with Bell in an interview room. Immediately, she recognized his voice.
I can just remember the feeling as if it were yesterday. Oh my gosh, this is the man. You know, this is the man that killed Sherry. I can't believe I'm sitting in a room with him.
Police questioned Bell for nearly 12 hours, but got nowhere. Again, police would use the profile to trap Larry Jean Bell, fortified by a secret weapon. Profiler John Douglas was still in South Carolina when Bell was arrested. Sheriff Metz, who had been questioning the suspect, had grown tired of his rambling denial. Metz wanted to let the profiler interview Larry Jean Bell. In a highly unusual move, the sheriff introduced Bell to the man whose criminal profile had led to his arrest.
And he says, you know, they did a profile you would fit you right to a T, right down to everything about you.
Drawing on his years of profiling experience, Douglas interviewed Bell.
And I sit on the edge of the table and I said, you know, a lot of people don't understand the criminal personality. But one of the things I found is that in my research, sometimes like two sides of one's personality. I found there's been a good side and a bad side, almost like a multiple personality. And after they perpetrate the crime, this one side isn't even aware of this bad side.
The suspect paused for a moment. Then he spoke. He told the profiler that, quote, the good Larry Jean Bell could never have done this. But the bad Larry Gene Bell could very well have committed these crimes. Based on the evidence found at the Shepherd home and the incriminating statements made in his interview with Douglas, Bell went on trial for the murder of Sherry Faye Smith in January 1986. Prosecutor Donnie Myers, impressed with the profiler's work during the investigation, wanted Douglas back in South Carolina during the trial to help with prosecution strategy. The profiler, knowing Bell was using an insanity defense, made an offhand prediction about his courtroom behavior.
I asked John, what do you think Bell will do the first time that I bring him into court? John told me, he'll cause a disturbance. There'll be an outburst. The first time we'll bring Bell into court is an outburst.
As he had done in the trial of Wayne Williams 4 years later, Douglas agreed to provide advice to the prosecution in the Bell case. Nearly 3 weeks later, a jury found Larry Gene Bell guilty of the murder of Sherry Smith. In March 1987, he was convicted of Deborah Helmick's murder. He was sentenced to death. After 2 appeals, he was executed in 1996. The cases of Larry Gene Bell, Robert Hansen, and Wayne Williams have become textbook cases of how profiling can work. Local police departments are now routinely trained in the technique. Many city and state police agencies have their own profiler on staff. It is a trend that worries John Douglas.
This isn't name that tune. I could become a profiler in 3 beats. I mean, the training that my own people go through is 2 years.
It is a simple idea, really, using deductive reasoning and basic clues to create a portrait of a killer.
There's no such thing as profile A for this type of murder, profile B for this type of murder. The art of profiling depends greatly upon the human mind. It depends greatly upon human experience. It depends upon common sense. And you use your common sense to arrive at, quote, a profile of the unidentified offender, end quote.
This program chronicles the crimes of serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, the description of which some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
There is no question in my mind that what Jeffrey Dahmer became was the embodiment of evil.
First thing that we saw was a human head that was in a refrigerator.
The bodies had totally disappeared, not a trace. None of them knew what had happened to their sons.
And no one in a million years could have guessed the monstrosity that was inside his head.
When the city of Milwaukee awoke on the morning of July 23, 1991, the damage had already been done. Best known for its many breweries, Milwaukee had overnight become notorious as the home of one of the worst serial killers in history. The night before, in a small one-bedroom apartment on the city's west side, police had discovered a death chamber. Only one man ever escaped that apartment to tell the story. 6 months later, in the Milwaukee County Courthouse, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards would recount a night of sheer terror at the hands of Jeffrey Dahmer. Late in the afternoon of July 22nd, Dahmer approached Edwards, who was eating with some friends at the Grand Avenue Mall.
And he said he was a professional photographer. He usually pays people for pictures and stuff like that if anybody was interested in making money at that time.
He offered Edwards $100 to pose nude at Dahmer's apartment. According to Edwards, there was no indication of any homosexual intent.
He didn't even act like it at that time.
At first, Edwards hesitated, but needed the money and agreed to go to Dahmer's apartment to check things out. They entered the Oxford apartment complex, and Dahmer unlocked the door to apartment 213.
When we got inside, he turned off burglar alarms. I asked him why. First, it was a foul odor, okay?
Tell us about that. What kind of an odor?
It was just like an odor. I didn't quite know what it was. You know, he told me a sewer pipe had broke and management would take care of it.
There were security cameras and a sophisticated alarm system.
He said the part of the neighborhood he was in, he was protecting his property, things like that. It was like normal, pretty decent apartment, had nice things in it.
They sat down on the couch. Tracy Edwards suspected nothing. He was simply visiting with a normal, everyday person, a good conversationalist.
He asked me, was I interested in doing the photography? You know, I told him I was still contemplating, so therefore he offered me a beer and a rum and coke mixture.
Dahmer drank a beer too, as Edwards sipped at his rum and coke.
I'm not a big liquor drinker, so it didn't taste that good to me.
While he didn't know it then, his distaste for liquor may have saved Tracy Edwards' life. The drink was drugged, Dahmer's modus operandi for gaining control over his victims. To Edwards, the mood seemed to grow heavy. He decided to skip the photos and prepared to leave.
Yeah, then I was just, I don't know, getting a little agitated maybe, you know, because of the smell and things. And then he threw my conversation off talking about the fish in the fish tank, you know.
As Edwards turned to look at the fish, Dahmer seized the moment. He slapped a handcuff on Edwards' left wrist and placed a large knife against his ribs.
I think, like, you know, what's going on, you know? This guy is so nice, and all of a sudden, you know, it's like he's pulling knives and handcuffs and all on me, you know. He told me at that point if I wouldn't do what he said, he would kill me. It's like not the same person that we met at Grand Avenue Mall.
How does he different?
His face structure seemed different, you know. His body structure is like it wasn't him anymore, you know. It's like it was a totally different guy there.
Dahmer then seemed to calm down. He told Edwards the key to the handcuffs was in the bedroom, and with the knife at Edwards' back, guided him there. As they entered the bedroom, Edwards noticed a large blue drum against the wall, but didn't ask about it. With Edwards still cuffed on his left wrist only, they sat on the bed together and began to watch a tape of The Exorcist III, which Dahmer said was his favorite movie. Periodically, while watching the tape, Dahmer would rock back and forth, mumbling and chanting.
And then he would turn around and try to ask me to put both of my hands behind my back, and I wouldn't, you know, do it. I would talk to him. I'd tell him, you can trust me. You know, you don't have to do this, and that would calm him down a little bit.
After a while, Dahmer assumed control again.
He told me to lay down, face down, put both of my hands behind my back, because he changed again at that point, like he got more aggressive at that time. He kind of laid across me, put his head across my chest, like he was listening to my heart, because at a point he told me he was going to eat my heart at that point.
Said he was going to eat your heart?
Yes, that's correct.
Did he still have the knife?
Yeah.
Where was the knife pointed?
When I was on the floor, he had it pointed at my groin area at that time. I knew something was about to happen, so I suggested that I go to the bathroom. I had to use the bathroom.
Dahmer let him go. Edwards said he seemed calmer when he returned.
Yeah, I told him I want to sit in the front because it's an air conditioner. I was just going to try to jump out the window or go for the door. So I had unbuttoned my shirt to try to make him feel more at ease. And then I just sat on the couch and he just started going out of himself again.
You know? Going out of himself?
Yeah, he was like paying me no attention at that time.
Edwards seized the opportunity. He hit Dahmer and bolted out the door. As he ran down the street, he flagged a passing police car. The police, with Edwards, returned to the apartment and found Dahmer and his chamber of horrors. There were photos strewn about of young men in various stages of dismemberment. Realizing the enormity of the crime scene, police arrested Dahmer, sealed the apartment, and called in County Medical Examiner Dr. Jeffrey Jensen.
First thing that we saw was a human head that was in a refrigerator, and after that it was we considered to be a localized disaster.
Jensen then led a room-by-room search, finding body parts, skulls, and a human heart in the freezer. They found soup kettles filled with skulls, male genitals, and human hands. There was a complete skeleton in the bedroom, and the blue tub contained 3 human torsos.
In the freezer component, there was another frozen skeleton, and that was also inventoried. And then it was the process of piecing together, so to speak, the different body parts with skulls.
The morning after his arrest, the startling images of Jeffrey Dahmer's freezer and other evidence being hauled out of his apartment beamed all over the world. In Milwaukee, the discovery of a serial killer terrified families who had loved ones missing.
Less than 5 minutes.
Stanley Miller's nephew, Ernest, had disappeared 10 months earlier.
That morning when I woke up and saw it on the news, something just drew me there, I just knew he was there.
He was right. Ernest Miller's skull was among those discovered in the apartment. It was Oliver Lacey's head in the refrigerator, the head of Emmanuel Lacey's father and Catherine Lacey's son.
I even went over there and I seen them take him out and all his things, and I walked around the building and I got a cold feeling in my stomach. It's like a pain had hit me in my stomach.
The pain would turn to horror as they learned exactly how their loved ones died. Necrophilia, dismemberment, cannibalism, lobotomies. Within hours of his arrest, Jeffrey Dahmer admitted to all this and more.
He wanted to confess. It was clearly voluntary. He wanted to get it off. He helped the police solve murders that they didn't even know about, that they were murders. So he wanted to unload.
His full confession would detail 11 murders within his tiny apartment, 4 more in the basement of his grandmother's house, 1 in a hotel room, and another, his first, in 1979 in his boyhood home in Bath, Ohio. His upbringing, as he traced it now for police, was in some ways unusual for a serial killer.
He was not sexually abused, and he was not physically abused by his parents. A third feature, less frequently found, but often found in serial killers, is economic deprivation. In other words, raised in financial hardships. Quite the opposite was the case in Dahmer's situation. He was raised in an affluent home. Indeed, they lived on 1 1/4 wooded acres with a private pond. Dahmer's father is an educated man with a doctor's degree in chemistry. In my opinion, Dahmer himself has a superior intellect.
But in another respect, he did fit the profile of a serial killer. He was a loner who had difficulty relating to people. Author and retired FBI agent Robert Ressler coined the term serial killer during his time as head of the FBI unit that tracks such criminals. He has studied the childhood behavior of many serial killers and found that most don't interact well, rarely dating as teenagers. In their isolation, they begin to have powerful fantasies.
The fantasies become violent, retribution, getting even with those who have been unfair with me, hurting others, destroying property, vandalism, setting fires. All these things kind of become interwoven with sexual fantasies. And the sexual fantasies, which again are normal for a young pre-adolescent or adolescent, become abnormal in that they become violent, they become hostile.
As children, many serial killers abuse animals. In his confession, Jeffrey Dahmer talked at length about his adolescent fascination with dissection, even picking up roadkills to examine the anatomy. A boyhood neighbor stumbled across this dog's head, mounted in Dahmer's backyard. Around the same time he was mutilating animals, Dahmer had his first homosexual experience with a friend who lived nearby. But as he discovered his homosexuality, his fantasies became deviant.
It had nothing to do with him being gay. If he had been heterosexual, his victims would have been women.
At the trial, court-appointed psychiatrist George Palermo recounted one of Dahmer's teenage fantasies about a male jogger.
I liked him, and I had the idea of hitting him on the head and having sex with him. Those are the words that he stated.
He, in fact, tried to do that, but the man didn't jog by that day, and so it didn't come to pass. This was quite early,
Forensic psychiatrist Park Dietz spent many hours interviewing Dahmer. He feels that Dahmer somehow began to associate sexual arousal with the mutilation of animals and thoughts of harming and controlling people.
My best guess of how that happened is that he was at the age at which all boys are having sexual arousal in response to diverse stimuli. Boys of that age get stimulated while they're riding to school on the bus or on a roller coaster. And in the course of that, they can, without trying to, without knowing it, become conditioned to quite coincidental stimuli. And I think that's what happened to Dahmer, that somehow he became conditioned accidentally to thoughts of violence and control and mutilation.
Dahmer's sexual attractions and his ability to control them would become the central question in his 1992 sanity trial. In high school, Dahmer was regarded as something of an oddball. Often ridiculed, he resorted to playing the clown to get attention. Classmates began referring to any prank as doing a Dahmer. Perhaps his most creative effort was on a class trip to Washington, D.C. Classmates recall that on a dare, he talked his way into a personal tour of the Vice President's White House office, a spot not normally open to visitors. He attended his senior prom in May 1978 with 16-year-old Bridget Geiger. A nervous Jeffrey, afraid he would stick Bridget with the pin, had Geiger's mother put on the corsage. Just weeks after the prom, Dahmer would kill his first victim. There is no single key that unlocks the mystery of Jeffrey Dahmer, but one clue lies in the relationship of his parents, which was troubled at best. When Jeffrey was 18, they divorced. His mother Joyce left for Wisconsin, and Father Lionel, with younger brother David, stayed at a nearby motel. In the confusion of the separation, Jeffrey was left alone for several weeks in the house on West Bath Road. When he picked up hitchhiker Stephen Hicks, Dahmer didn't know he would kill him. They came back to Dahmer's empty home and had a couple of beers. But when Hicks decided it was time to get going, Dahmer was in no mood to be alone. The guy wanted to leave, Dahmer recalled. I didn't want him to leave. He picked up a barbell and hit Hicks over the head, and then strangled him. Jeffrey Dahmer had acted out his fantasy, and now the grim reality of a dead body was staring him in the face. He took the corpse into a crawl space beneath the house and cut it up, placing portions of it in plastic garbage bags. He loaded Hicks' body in his car and headed for the local dump. On the way, a policeman stopped him for swerving over the center line and administered a sobriety test, which Dahmer passed. Dahmer was just about to leave when the officer noticed the garbage bags in the back seat. Smoothly, Dahmer explained that it was garbage from his parents' house. The unsuspecting officer sent him on his way. Dahmer had told the most important lie of his young life and gotten away with it. A frightened Jeffrey Dahmer took the body back home and into the crawl space. There, with a sledgehammer, he broke the bones into tiny bits. He took the fragments to a hillside on his property and, spinning slowly in a full circle, scattered the bones all over the land. Stephen Hicks had totally disappeared.
The first slaying occurred in 1978. The parents had no idea what happened to their son. No trace of the body was found until Dahmer confessed in 1991. That was 13 years of living hell.
Jeffrey Dahmer was repulsed by what he had done. Already a heavy drinker in high school, he continued to seek refuge in alcohol. He entered Ohio State University in the fall of 1978, but drank himself out of school after one semester. His father was concerned and talked Jeffrey into joining the Army. He did so and trained to be a medic, spending untold hours studying human anatomy. He was shipped to Germany, but was discharged 2 years later at the age of 20, again because his drinking was so compulsive. Feeling lost, he came to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother in this house, tucked into the safe, tidy suburb of West Allis. Although arrested in 1982 for exposing himself to 2 adolescent boys, the 22-year-old Dahmer tried, in his own words, to walk the straight and narrow. For a while, he attended church with his grandmother and stopped drinking. In his confession, he stated that he tried at this time to suppress any homosexual thoughts. He got work in a blood plasma center and later as a mixer, making candies for Ambrosia chocolates. But eventually he slipped back into drinking. He began going out to gay bars and sometimes not coming home. In November 1987, in the 219 Club, Jeffrey Dahmer met Steve Toomey. The two left together and got a room at the Ambassador Hotel. According to Dahmer, they drank heavily and engaged in consensual sex. Dahmer passed out, and when he awoke, Toomey was lying in bed next to him, dead. Dahmer was confused. He bought a large suitcase and put Toomey's body inside it. He then walked out the front door of the hotel and hailed a cab. He had the driver help him with his heavy baggage and headed for his grandmother's house. With his grandmother gone to church, he took the body to the basement and dismembered it. When he was finished, he threw it all out in the trash. It had been 9 years since Stephen Hicks, and now Dahmer had killed again. This time, he would no longer resist his violent fantasies. 2 months later, Dahmer was back at the 219 Club. Outside, he met a 14-year-old Native American boy, James Dockstader. He asked James if he wanted to come to West Allis with him and make some money posing naked for pictures. Dockstader agreed and became victim number 3. Dahmer was perfecting the process. Once back at his grandmother's house, Dahmer slipped a drug into a drink, and when Dockstader passed out, Dahmer had oral sex with him, strangled, dismembered, and then disposed of him. 2 months after killing Dockstader, Dahmer repeated the ritual with Richard Guerrero. In September 1988, the 28-year-old Dahmer left his grandmother's house and rented a cheap apartment in a rough section of town. The day after he moved in, he went cruising for men, and not far from his new apartment came across a 13-year-old Laotian named Suntom Synthesymphone. He enticed the boy to his apartment to take pictures. While waiting for the sleeping potion to kick in, Dahmer began to fondle the boy. The boy panicked and ran out of the apartment to his nearby home. When Suntom's parents heard their son's story, they called the police, who arrested Dahmer. On January 30th, 1989, Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of second-degree sexual assault. He was released on bond until sentencing in May. In the interim, he would kill again. This time, the victim was 24-year-old Anthony Sears. At the May sentencing, the 5-time killer spoke to the judge and pleaded for leniency on his sexual assault charge. This enticing a child was the climax of my idiocy. If anything would shock me out of my past behavior patterns, it is this. The judge felt that there was still hope of saving the sex offender and sentenced Dahmer to a year in a work-release prison with orders that he receive treatment for his drinking and sexual problems. But in a bureaucratic mix-up, as Dahmer approached his release date a year later, he still had not received counseling for alcoholism. In March 1990, Dahmer's father, Lionel, wrote a letter to the judge for the case asking him not to release his son before he had completed a treatment program. I sincerely hope that you might intervene in some way to help my son, who I love very much and for whom I want a better life. This may be our last chance to institute something lasting. One day after Lionel Dahmer mailed that letter, his son Jeffrey walked out of prison. On May 13th, he signed a lease for apartment 213 in the Oxford Apartments. 2 weeks later, he would kill again. Most serial killers are sexual deviants. Usually they are either sadists, like Ted Bundy, or they are necrophiles, like Jeffrey Dahmer. Sadists enjoy the power of taking a human life, but Jeffrey Dahmer hated killing.
He had to get himself intoxicated every time he killed one of his victims, and he had to get himself intoxicated again in order to dismember them, because he found those aspects distasteful.
But it was a means to an end in obtaining a sexual partner. Ernest Miller, near the Oxford Apartments. Miller was an accomplished dancer. Dahmer later told police he immediately took a liking to the muscular 24-year-old and offered him money to pose for pictures. Miller agreed, and once in the apartment, Dahmer drugged him. But Miller woke up sooner than expected, and Dahmer, instead of strangling him, was forced to slit his throat. Dahmer had sex with the dead body, and while he was still naked, dismembered it. Dahmer later stated he always dismembered his victims while in the nude.
What he wanted was something that he could hug, spend his time next to, fondle, and not have any demands made for sodomy, which he did not like. The dilemma he had was that he didn't have the social skills to find someone who would find that gratifying and wanted no more.
Dahmer began to keep souvenirs. He took Polaroids as Miller bled to death on the bed. Dahmer then decapitated him, boiled the flesh off the head, painted the skull, and kept it. It's common among serial killers to keep jewelry, photos, even body parts of victims as a keepsake. Dahmer took it one horrifying step further with Ernest Miller.
He related this was a person he really liked. He indicated that he had filleted his heart and kept it in the freezer, and he also kept his bicep. He stated that it tasted like beef or a filet mignon. He ate only the people that he really liked, and he wanted them to be a part of him or with him all the time.
Sometimes I just think, well, maybe this is just a bad dream. You know, I'm gonna wake up tomorrow and all this whole thing has been a bad dream, because there's no one in this world like that.
In fact, Dahmer may have represented a new wave of serial killer.
Initially, the serial killers were like Ted Bundy, the predator serial killer, picking up a victim in a bar, sexually assaulting and disposing of the bodies. Sometimes, as in the case of the hillside stranglers, dumping up the side of the road. We are now finding these individuals spending more time with their victims and having a desire to keep that relationship going for a period of time. This hit-and-run type is becoming less frequent, and the collector, as I call them, is becoming more frequent.
Dahmer was attracted to men with dark skin and thin, athletic builds. He was also a necrophile. But he wasn't necessarily drawn to corpses. He wanted a completely compliant partner.
He tried various strategies to solve that need of his. He drugged men so that they would be available to him all night long. He stole a mannequin from a department store so that he could lie next to that and fondle it.
And Dahmer even had a fantasy that he tried to pursue actively, and that was to create a sex zombie by drilling holes in the heads of his victim with a drill and injecting acid into the brains of his victims in just a limited amount. The fantasy was to kill the brain, to kill the willpower.
It was classic serial killer thinking, making the human into an object. In late May, Dahmer killed Tony Hughes, a deaf mute whom he had known for some time. Dahmer told police that, as with his other victims, Hughes came to his apartment to make money posing for pictures. In nearly all the murders, police had only Dahmer's confession to go on. While much of it was later confirmed as true, Tony Hughes' mother feels Dahmer not only killed her son, he lied about him afterward.
He knew my son, and my son trusted him as a friend. And he didn't have to go to his house for money, because today the last day I saw him, he had cashed his check. He had over $400 in his pocket. So he didn't need his $50, and he wasn't a prostitute out on the street either, like the media portrayed all of them. I'm speaking for Tony. I can't speak for anybody else. I know about my son.
2 days after killing Tony Hughes, Dahmer went to the Grand Avenue Mall. He testified he met an Asian boy and struck up a conversation with him. As had worked so often before, Dahmer said he offered him $50 to come to his apartment to take pictures. The boy agreed. Although Dahmer stated he did not know it at the time, the boy was Conorak Synthesophone, the brother of the boy Dahmer had been arrested for fondling in 1988. After Conorak passed out from the drug drink, Dahmer had oral sex with the boy and then went out to get more beer. The boy woke up while Jeffrey was gone. He was naked and disoriented from the drugs. He stumbled out of the apartment and into the street. Neighbors tried to help the boy and saw bruises on his body. One of them made this 911 call.
Okay, hi, I'm on 25th and State, and this is a young man. He is butt naked. He has been beaten up. He is very bruised up. He can't stand. He's study fall out. He is butt naked. He has no clothes on. He was really hurt. And I ain't got no cord on him. I just seen him, and he needs some help.
Where is he at?
On 25th and State, the corner of 25th and State.
A police squad car and an ambulance were immediately dispatched. Jeffrey Dahmer was returning from a neighborhood bar when he saw the crowd on the corner of 25th and State. As he had done many times before, Dahmer coolly walked up to the authorities and lied. He told the police he and Konarak were lovers who had had a fight. He laughed and said Konarak had acted this way before when he had had too much to drink. The officers went back to the apartment where Dahmer showed them some pictures of Konarak and himself. Police later reported that Konarak tried to speak in a slurred Asian dialect, but was unintelligible. The officers noticed an odd smell in the apartment, but did not investigate. If they had gone into the bedroom, they would have stumbled across Tony Hughes' decomposing body. Had they run Jeffrey Dahmer's name through police computers, it would have told them he was still on probation for a sex crime. In the end, the officers took Dahmer at his word that the 14-year-old boy was an adult. They left Konarak with Dahmer in the living room. Back at the squad car, they chuckled about the unique domestic disturbance.
The intoxicated Asian naked male was returned to his sober boyfriend, and we're 10-8.
Dahmer later confessed that moments after the officers left, he strangled Konarak and had sex with the body. He took pictures as he dismembered the corpse and then put the torso in the big blue vat. Dahmer kept the skull.
Basic law enforcement practices were not followed.
When the story of the incident broke after Dahmer's arrest, Police Chief Philip Ariola suspended the 3 officers. The incident ignited the gay and minority communities into weeks of rallies, vigils, and protests over police insensitivity.
It's nice that you suspended the people, but we don't want anybody suspended. We want to be treated with dignity.
Milwaukee's mayor would call it the most traumatic time in the city's history. Not long after he killed Konarak Synthesymphone, Dahmer lost his job at the chocolate factory. He was broke, behind on his rent, and spending all his money on cruising and buying materials for disposing of the bodies. The one momentary pleasure for him was sex, which inevitably led to murder. Dahmer would kill 4 more young men before Tracy Edwards was lucky enough to escape on July 22nd, 1991. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer opened on January 30th, 1992, 6 months after his arrest. A bulletproof shield divided the spectators from the participants. It was an audience filled largely with victims' families, as well as Dahmer's father and stepmother.
All right, please.
Jeffrey Dahmer did not testify at the trial. He had already pleaded guilty to the killings. The only question was his sanity at the time of the murders. If found insane, Dahmer would be housed in a mental institution. The burden of proving he was not sane fell to the defense.
I think everybody's initial reaction is, you have to be nuts to do something like this. And that is the first reaction of everybody. That's one thing to say that. It's another thing to prove it. And in order to prove it, you must show psychosis.
Psychosis is that particular mental malady where the person can't understand reality. When they think a stick is a bat, or they fear that a human being is a devil, that type of unreality. One of the more famous ones, the Son of Sam case, where the man was taking orders from a dog.
At least he said he was. Serial killer David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam, murdered 6 young women in New York in the mid-1970s. When he was apprehended, Berkowitz said he was insane. It was not convincing to the judge, who found him competent to stand trial. He was sentenced to life in prison. In the Dahmer trial, the jury first had to determine if the killer had a mental disease, and if he did, was he able to understand that his actions were wrong? And further, was he able to act in accordance with the law? Dahmer's defense was that his mental illness was necrophilia, and that his sexual urges toward dead bodies became so strong that he couldn't stop himself from killing. As the prosecution saw it, Dahmer was not crazy, but slowly accepted the idea of killing.
Certainly as Jeffrey Dahmer first thought of the idea of having sex with an unconscious man and then a dead man, certainly it shocked him, but he kept turning over the fantasy in his mind. Finally it became tolerable, and then he decided to act out on the fantasy, to realize it.
And when he did kill, McCann argued, he was sane and even methodical. Dahmer would most often cruise for victims on Friday, so he would have the weekend to enjoy and dispose of the bodies. If he didn't meet someone on Friday, he wouldn't kill that week. Dahmer never attacked on the street, only in the controlled environment of his apartment. He never picked up anyone with a car, because he figured abandoned cars of missing persons would provide clues for police.
So he was a man that demonstrated consistently that when he wished to do it, he could control himself. Police asked him, Mr. Dahmer, do you know what you're doing was wrong? He said, well, absolutely. That's why I put double locks on the doors. That's why I had television cameras, so that anyone broke in, that they would see, they'd leave before they discover the bodies.
It was never a question of whether or not he understood the wrongfulness was kind of, he knew what he was doing was wrong. The question was, was he able to stop it? I think as he progressed into this killing spree that he certainly got crazier and crazier. So basically I tried to argue that he was crazy certainly after about the 9th or 10th murder.
It was about that time, in the spring of 1991, that Dahmer began to experiment with the idea of creating a decorative altar of skulls. He never built the altar, but later sketched it for police. And it was also around the time he tried to give his victims crude lobotomies to create sex zombies who would never leave him.
To me, that is not a sane fantasy. That is not something coming from a person who has their psychological act together. It's coming from a person that has lost, really have stripped their gears of sanity and are now wallowing in some sort of a psychotic haze.
Psychiatrist Park Dietz testified for the prosecution. He feels that Dahmer was not the runaway train Jerry Boyle described, but as with most serial killers, one with Dahmer at the controls.
Nothing drives any of these men from fantasy to action, except themselves. They're in the driver's seat.
In his closing argument, Prosecutor McCann played on the issue of Dahmer's characteristic lying. McCann warned the jury not to be fooled.
He fooled the police in Bath, Ohio. He fooled the police when he had Hicks' body in his car. He fooled the Milwaukee police on the counteract Simpson Doan case. Ladies and gentlemen, he's fooled a lot of people, including the court that gave him a year's probation. Please, please, don't let this murderous killer fool you.
Jerry Boyle, however, offered a synopsis of Dahmer's life that portrayed a sick, out-of-control man.
Jeffrey Dahmer, as a total human being, a person who's into fantasy, drugging, keeping skulls in locker, cannibalism, having delusions, chanting and rocking, picking up roadkill, going and trying to get a mannequin home so he can play sex with a mannequin, posing people who are dead that he killed for pictures, masturbating all over the place. This is Jeffrey Dahmer.
Family members of victims tried to pass the time as the jury deliberated. It took less than a day to return a verdict.
In regard to the death of Ernest Miller, did the defendant Jeffrey L. Dahmer have a mental disease? Answer, no.
For every murder with which he was charged, Dahmer was found sane. At a press conference later, District Attorney McCann told reporters how happy he was that uncontrollable sexual urges had not been accepted as grounds for insanity.
We were all concerned of this emerging as a defense, not just in a murder case, but more likely in rape cases and child molesting cases.
At the sentencing hearing 2 days later, Judge Lawrence Graham allowed victims' families to tell both the court and Dahmer about the impact the crimes had made. It was one of the most emotional moments of the trial.
You took my 17-year-old son away from me. I'll never get a chance to tell him that I loved him. I'd have a chance to tell him that I loved him the last time I saw him, which will be a year tomorrow.
Never, Jeffrey! Jeffrey! I hate you, mother. I hate you! This is out of control! Don't me, Jeffrey! I'll kill you! God damn it! Look at me, mother. I kill you!
What's your name, fast?
Once order was restored, Dahmer, who never testified, addressed the court.
I know how much harm I have caused. I tried to do the best I could after the arrest to make amends, but no matter what I did, I could not undo the terrible harm I have caused. My attempt to help identify the remains was the best that I could do, and that was hardly anything. I know the families of the victims will never be able to forgive me for what I have done. I have seen their tears, and if I could give my life right now to bring their loved ones back, I would do it. I am so very sorry.
Judge Graham then read the sentence.
Count 1, the court will impose the mandatory life sentence.
Dahmer received the maximum penalty for each and every count. But his story was far from finished. In fact, it began to take on a life of its own. Jeffrey Dahmer was one of the most publicized serial killers in history. But the fascination with such murders began more than a century ago. In London, between September and November of 1888, someone murdered and mutilated 5 prostitutes. The killer wrote letters to the police and the London Times, taunting them with clues of his next murder. He signed the letters, Jack the Ripper. The lasting appeal of the Ripper legend is that he stopped after 5 killings and was never caught. Jack the Ripper became a model for how the media portrays serial killers. Modern-day killers like Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, and Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, gained catchy nicknames in the press. Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, also wrote letters to the newspapers. Our dark fascination with serial murders has spilled into our entertainment, spawning some of the most popular movies ever made. Inevitably, as the Jeffrey Dahmer case grabbed worldwide attention, those with an eye to profit took the marketing of killers one step further. Serial killer trading cards, T-shirts, even a comic book exploited and glamorized the crimes.
I don't think my book will bother him as much as the fact that Dahmer was in the top 25 most intriguing people of 1991 for People magazine.
Serial killers are mostly intrigued by themselves. In fact, they are so self-centered that one source of ego fulfillment can be the body count. In August 1991, when Jeffrey Dahmer's case was one of the top stories in the country, police in Mississippi arrested Donald Leroy Evans for killing a 6-year-old girl. Soon, Evans confessed to nearly 60 killings across the country, causing just the kind of speculation a serial killer enjoys.
It involves enough bodies to make people forget almost what happened in Milwaukee.
But to date, very few of the murders Evans confessed to have been verified. With homicide rates soaring nationally in the last 30 years, serial killers may be losing some of their shock value. When William Herons killed 3 people in Chicago in 1945, it was called the crime of the century.
Herons only killed 3 people. And when I say only killed 3 people, by today's standard, you don't even get attention of the media unless you've knocked off about 12 or 15 people.
In fact, it's all too easy to watch the stories about serial killers unfold in our newspapers and on our TV screens. It's a safe titillation of the height of evil, as long as we keep a distance. The alternative is not to hear about the killings at all, as was the case in the old Soviet Union. Under communist rule, the press was strictly censored in reporting violent crime. As a result, Russians never knew that serial killers like Andrei Chikatilo were on the prowl. The self-proclaimed mad beast murdered 53 people in a 10-year spree. With the end of censorship, his 1992 trial received wide press coverage and left viewers in disbelief and shock. Milwaukee is a city still healing from the crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer's apartment building was torn down about a year after the trial, erasing a painful landmark of his crimes. Then, on November 28, 1994, at the state prison in Portage, Wisconsin, Dahmer was sent on a bathroom cleaning detail with 2 other prisoners. When guards left the 3 unattended, one of the inmates, Chris Scarver, who called himself Christ, attacked both his fellow prisoners with a metal bar from a weight set. 2 hours later, Jeffrey Dahmer was pronounced dead at Divine Savior Hospital. The horror that one man brought upon an entire city is still difficult to comprehend.
There is no question in my mind that what Jeffrey Dahmer became was the embodiment of evil. I think that if we had lived in the Middle Ages, that would have been the defense. And a jury might have believed that, in fact, the devil took over his being and caused him to do these things.
Dahmer, of course, is evil. Dahmer knew it was wrong all the time. One of the reasons that he drank as he did the killings, I think, was to silence his conscience, to dull his conscience. This isn't a man that didn't know right from wrong. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was evil.
The hardest thing for the public to accept is that these men view humans as so inferior to themselves that the death of another is trivial compared to the momentary pleasure of the killer. His orgasm is more valuable than your life.
I call him Halley's Comet. He's a total mystery. Comes around once every 75 years. Can't figure out why, but he's there, and thank God it's only once every 75 years.